In today's Locked On Pelicans, I'm going to tell you what we need to see from Zion Williamson this season, plus a great trade target actually can't be traded and more. It's the Monday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans and NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Monday. The NBA season starts this week. I'm excited. I know you're excited. We'll have all the coverage you could want right here on the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Don't forget, become an everydayer of Locked On Pelicans. That means you listen Monday through Friday. Make us your first listen as well. And in today's show, we're going to tell you what we need to see from Zion Williamson this season. I have a great question we're going to answer here. We're going to look at the Kawhi Leonard injury impact on the Los Angeles Clippers because it impacts the Pelicans in multiple ways, including ruling out a trade target. And then I want to get into Willie Green's job security a little bit and what you might see happen with him this season. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. This season, you can start this season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. It's a programming note here. You see the background. It's a little bit different. You're going to see a bunch of different ones this week if you're watching along on YouTube. I'm actually driving across the country from Los Angeles to New Orleans. Yes, it's like the worst timed week for it, but it's the only thing that I can do. So going to be in a car. You'll be seeing me come to you from hotel rooms. So we'll get back to normal next week in terms of the backgrounds and all that. The audio is a little bit weird. I don't control the rooms here. So we're going to do our best when it comes to all of that. But we're going to have shows every single day talking about what you want to hear when it comes to all of that. So let's dive into the first topic in today's show. And I thought this was a really great question. I wanted to talk about Zion Williamson anyway, and how, that segment could be summed up as the Pelicans are going to go as far as Zion Williamson takes him. And I don't know if that's actually true, and maybe we'll look at that a little bit more, but he's obviously the most important piece. So this question comes from at GoGo Ingram, who's using the handle right now, VillainBI. And the question is, what do we need to see from Zion this season for this team to justifiably be built around him going forward? So this is an interesting question to answer because the short answer of it, there's a long and a short answer. The short answer is the team's decided they're going to build around him. They've decided that he is the centerpiece when it comes to this franchise. They're not looking to trade him this summer. They're looking to trade Brandon Ingram. That's hence the calls around the league, some of the discussions, and look, those just not going anywhere. It's why last offseason they entertained trading both, but were leaning a little bit more towards Brandon Ingram, from my understanding. So they seem committed to building around Zion Williamson already. You can say whether or not that's the smart thing, and that kind of gets into the question, but they've decided this. It's pretty cut and dry. If they didn't want to build around Zion, you could have traded him this offseason pretty easily, in fact, and you could have just given Ingram the extension. They have not done that. Now, they would still love to have Brandon Ingram on the team, but I think kind of the way they've gone about this is very clear that this is Zion's team. He's number one on the franchise, number one in terms of numbers, too. I don't think that's the incorrect decision. I do think his skill set is more elite than Brandon Ingram. What he does, I find to be just more elite in general. I think you can build more around him than you can other players, potentially. And that's why I think you're partially seeing them do that. But let's get into the question. What do we need to see from Zion Williamson this season for this team to justifiably, and I think that's the key to this, be built around him going forward? So first and foremost was the maturity, taking things seriously, being, acting like a professional NBA player. By all accounts, from everyone I've talked to, from just looking at the dude, from the mouths of his teammates, Trey Murphy was talking about this too. He's done that. He checked that box. He looks incredible. I have said for the everydayers, for the people who listen pretty often, that his season didn't start till January last year, and that was disappointing. It's starting on opening night. His season is starting on Wednesday. He looks like he is ready to go. No playing himself into game shape or anything like that. He looks like he's ready for game one. And while when he's not fully in shape, when he's not ready to go on game one, he can be pretty good. This is going to be a Zion Williamson like we haven't seen before. There's just a level of maturity, taking care of his body, and all of that we've never seen from him. Better late than never. We would have liked this earlier, certainly, but he has figured it out and he's doing the things, and that should lead to a pretty good season. So that box is checked. You just don't have those concerns about him like you used to. And I think that comes to the amount of games that he played last season. The biggest thing is, can he stay healthy? 70 games out of 82 last season is a pretty good number. And that's kind of we had 65 games as the benchmark for him last year. He exceeded that by 5. I think a lot of the questions about his health, even though that hamstring injury happened in the, play-in tournament, that was disappointing, not what we wanted to see. But overall, it does seem like he's checked the box when it comes to just the preparation. Injuries will happen, but it's at least not anything that we feel is like caused by him not taking things seriously, not stretching, not doing all of that. The second thing is health. Stay on the court. Stay on the court. Play 70 games. Play 70 games. And he did it last year. You got to do it again this year. If he has 2 seasons where he plays 70 or more games, I mean, you feel much more confident building around him. Now, part of it is also he's under contract, so it's just easier to do that as well in general. Look, I don't need to see as much of a mid-range. I don't need to see a little baby hook. I don't even need to see him shoot tons of threes. Just go out there and be Zion Williamson, and I'm going to be really happy with what you're going to get from him this season. But if he does add in, and I like the idea of a 3-point shot a little bit more than some of the other things that he might be doing, if he can expand his game even just slightly for how effective he is at the rim, the amount of space he'll get on the 3-point line, take those threes. He seems pretty confident in it. He's been working on those a lot in practice. Show us off a little bit more, or make your free throws better. Those are the type of things I think that I would call lagniappe to the maturity, the professionalism, the health, and playing games. But if he can get all of that, it's pretty good. And that's the type of guy that will get All-NBA buzz. Look, I had people who are voters for the All-NBA awards last season reaching out to me towards the end of the year, wanting to talk and learn a little bit more about Zion Williamson to see if he should be on their ballots. There were people really considering him for third team. Maybe they didn't put him on there, but there were a lot of people that were really considering him for third team All-NBA. So if he checks that maturity box, which he did, if he plays well, which we know he's going to do, whatever that looks like, shooting threes, mid-rangers, or just attacking the rim constantly, or assisting, point Zion, whatever it might be, we feel pretty good, confident that that box is going to be checked. So it comes down to the health and the games played. And if he does that, I mean, that's when I think you can say, yeah, we can build around this guy and he should be the center of the team going forward. I think, with this question, calling it justifiably, he hasn't always justified it just yet. But there's so much talent there that I think you have to. And I think he's well on his way to justifying that. So play your games, play well. And I think we're going to see a really good Zion Williamson season. And that's why they're building around him, even though they've already decided this a little bit. One guy who's not going to be playing games to start the year is Kawhi Leonard. That has a bigger impact on the Pelicans than you might think. And we'll talk about that coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by our sponsor, BetterHelp. Halloween lets us have fun with what scares us, but what about those fears that don't involve zombies and ghosts? Therapy is a great tool for facing your fears and finding ways to overcome them, because sometimes the scariest thing is not facing our fears in the first place and holding ourselves back. I've benefited from therapy. I've actually used BetterHelp personally. What I love about it is it's entirely online. It's convenient. It's flexible. I don't have time to go drive to a doctor's office, sit there, go in, then just drive home. What I love about this is it's all online. You can do it from your phone, your computer, your tablet, whatever, to have that therapy session that's going to help you be the best version of you, because you don't need to have gone through major trauma to utilize therapy and become the best version of yourself. Learn how to set boundaries, learn coping skills, whatever it is it might be, therapy can help you. So overcome your fears with BetterHelp. Just visit betterhelp.com/lockedonnba today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedonnba to get started. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. For your second listen today, we didn't have to suffer through a Saints game on Sunday, which was really nice. Go check out the Locked On Saints podcast, though. Make sense of the rest of the season. What are they playing for? What do we want to see? Ross Jackson, host of the Locked On Saints podcast, is going to tell you everything you need to know. Make Locked On Saints your second listen today. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's get into the second thing here, which I think is pretty big news, and that's Kawhi Leonard is going to be out indefinitely to start the NBA season. So one, this just sucks because as an NBA fan, we always want to see like the good players out there. And that's disappointing that he's not going to be ready to go. But there is a knock-on effect, I think, in two particular ways for the New Orleans Pelicans here. And the first and foremost one is the Clippers are going to stink. They're going to be bad this year. I thought they were already had one of the worst off seasons, losing Paul George, letting him go for free because they just want to give him an extra year on that deal to the Philadelphia 76ers. Yeah, they're happy with the depth that they signed, but depth doesn't replace one of those elite players, which Paul George is, especially a two-way guy like that. So they're going to be bad. And that just means it's one less team that the Pelicans need to try and overcome in the standings. For a brutal Western Conference, that Clippers team should be tanking. They won't because they don't really control their own first-round pick. But they're going to be bad this year, and that should mean just one less team the Pelicans are competing with for a playoff spot. I think they're going to be real bad. Their win total per FanDuel, by the way, America's #1 sportsbook, has dropped them like 10 wins from last season. That's pretty extreme. I think they're set at like 40 and a half, something like that is what the number is. I like the under on that. Big time like the under on that. So I don't know, it just helps New Orleans in that sense, right? Like Clippers, even though they've played the Clippers particularly well over the past couple of seasons, I don't know, give me like 3-4 more easy wins when it comes to that and not let me stress, not let any of us stress when it comes to all of it. The more interesting thing from that is, could they be sellers? They don't control their own first-round pick. It feels like they want to go through a rebuild. And maybe that's why they didn't offer Paul George that contract. Maybe they realized that Kawhi Leonard is just not going to be the same that he once was, which, look, that sucks. That's disappointing. But if you know he's not going to be the guy and you don't want to just have only Paul George as kind of your lead guy here, especially 34-year-old Paul George, yeah, maybe it was smart to let him go and then just know you're going to be bad and kind of go through a rebuild here. And usually what that then means is you're a seller at the trade deadline. We haven't seen, some insane trade deadlines over the past couple of years because of that play-in tournament, meaning more teams are in contention for the postseason. So now the Clippers could be big-time sellers and maybe get some good picks or just pieces back in return for the players that they have, which you don't always see. So this could be a time where they just take advantage of a seller's market and start to sell off some pieces. So if that's the case, what are we looking for? What do we want to try and pick off here from the Los Angeles Clippers? And the first name that comes to mind is they got a pretty decent center in Ivica Zubac. So here's the thing with that. As much as I like Zubac, and he's pretty good. This guy averaged 12 points per game last season, 9 rebounds, and 1.2 blocks. He's a pretty good shooter, not from three, but at least from the field. He gives you some, ability to switch on the perimeter. He gives you a little bit of rim protection. He's definitely a good rebounder. This is a guy that makes a lot of sense, I think, for the New Orleans Pelicans. They can't trade for him. And it's not that they don't have the salary to do it. It's not that they don't have the ammo to do it in terms of first-round picks. He signed an extension, and that means he can't be traded this season at all. So Zubac is off the board for the New Orleans Pelicans, which is pretty disappointing because that's a guy that I think you could slot right on in. It would make a ton of sense, but unfortunately is not going to be the case. So when you look at the rest of their roster, though, it doesn't mean that there isn't something that you could do. If they realize Kawhi Leonard's going to be out, but they want to pair him with another wing-type player, a la a Brandon Ingram, there's ways you could probably get a deal done with the Clippers here. You could easily pull off a trade that's for Norman Powell and PJ Tucker. PJ Tucker, who they want to cut and get rid of, and is going to be away from the team this season. Now, PJ Tucker isn't what he was when he was with the Houston Rockets, playing that small ball five for him. He's really been limited the past couple of seasons, 3-4 years now, it feels like, since he's been in his prime. And you would just use him to make the salary work. And I don't actually have the Clippers' future draft picks and what they own, but I love me some Norm Powell, and I think that's a guy that would be great off the bench for New Orleans. Could fill that kind of scoring role for Brandon Ingram too. Maybe you throw someone else in there as well, or maybe a couple of picks. They even have Mo Bamba that you could probably get pretty cheaply when it comes to all this, even if he's not particularly good. There are trades that you could work out here. Maybe because even though you can't get Zubac, they're desperate to try and improve. They're opening a brand new multi-billion-dollar arena that they want to put on a good product, which doesn't look like it's going to be good right now. The Intuit Dome, the Ballmer Dome, whatever you're calling it, they're having that 300-fan wall that they're doing when it comes to all of that. Look, if you want to fill that up, you need to be winning games. If you want to get a return on your investment, that team's not going to do it. Could you trade Brandon Ingram there? And I think the answer to that could be yes. They're a little bit more desperate maybe than they were before. You know, James Harden, the version of him now, isn't the guy that's going to lead you to very big time wins. You're going to need something else. Ingram, as a desperation move, could make a lot of sense. And even if you let him walk after a year, clear some salary off of your books, something they probably need to do if they want to go with a full-on reset here. But then Kawhi Leonard and Brandon Ingram, if Kawhi comes back healthy, I think makes some sense for the Los Angeles Clippers just because they need something there. Can you build a trade around Norm Powell, PJ Tucker, someone else? The answer, might be a little bit hard there. I don't think that's like a full yes to me. There would need to be a bunch of picks involved in terms of that. But I think you're starting to see a trade. So you can start to see where maybe this would work, or maybe you trade CJ McCollum there as they just kind of go through a rebuild, know they're going to be bad for a couple of years, so they take on that contract and instead send back Norm Powell, someone else. You can start to see the basis of a trade, I think, between these two teams. Norm Powell, you could start him. He could come off the bench. Look, if you trade Ingram and then Trey Murphy gets healthy, he plugs right into the starting lineup. Norm Powell can be your go-to scorer off the bench here. That's a guy that I think makes a lot of sense. He's making a little over $19 million this season. PJ Tucker is $11.5 million this coming season. He doesn't have much left in the tank, but you're using him just to make the salaries work. And then he's off your books next year. So it clears some salary cap space, or you could retrade him later down the line, maybe at the trade deadline as an expiring contract, even though those don't have the same kind of value that they once did, as a way to help out another team that's looking to clear some salary. So you can kind of see where a trade would make some sense here. But when it comes to the Clippers, the biggest thing is, no Zubac is going to be coming to New Orleans because he can't be traded. Maybe in the offseason, that's a guy that you could really go after. And I think he would make sense for New Orleans with what his contract would be. But overall, can't really get that done this year. And I wonder if there's a way to make a Brandon Ingram trade work. I think it's a long shot. We've seen teams around the league aren't really interested in him. But if Kawhi's going to be out for a period of time and they're just trying to rely on James Harden, I don't know, make a move for Brandon Ingram. And maybe that kind of turns your fortunes around just a little bit. Let me know what you think about that in the comments down below on YouTube. Do you like the idea of a Clippers trade? Do you like the idea of Norm Powell, PJ Tucker, and something else for Brandon Ingram to make that deal work, or is that not enough for you? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. So coming up next, Willie Green isn't exactly on the hot seat, but he could be sacrificed this season. That's the best way to put it, and I'll explain what I mean. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. NBA fans, Pelicans fans, this season you can start the year with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. If you want to get in on the Pelicans right now, Wednesday night is opening night, -7.5 over the Chicago Bulls. Do you feel confident about the Pelicans? We don't know what the starting lineup is going to be. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. If you feel good about them, take that -5.5 or 7.5. They do really well on opening night. Maybe Lonzo Ball is convincing you that the Bulls could be good. Take the +7.5 there. You can also get in on the Pelicans futures, the over/under. You can get in on Zion for MVP. All you have to do is put down a $5 bet, and you're going to get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. And you can do that all over at FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And now for your second listen, Locked On NBA. We're there Monday through Friday recapping all the games. You didn't watch because you didn't have time or you didn't want to stay up late. It's like too long didn't watch for you on the Locked On NBA podcast, recapping all of the games, the biggest stories that you need to know. So make that your second listen today. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Become an everydayer of Locked On Pelicans. I can't say that enough. We're going to have a lot of great stuff for you this season. Look, I am traveling, road tripping across the country here, and we're still going to be pumping out shows for you, looking at the topics that you want to hear about, that what you want to know about this team. We'll look at some of the starting lineup stuff tomorrow. If they go a certain strategy, I'm going to be very bothered by this, and that doesn't bode well, and I'll tell you what that is. And that's going to be in tomorrow's episode of Locked On Pelicans here. But I want to talk about Willie Green for a minute, because I don't think Willie Green's on the hot seat going in. I do think James Borrego is there. And there's kind of like that specter of him looming a little bit behind Willie Green. But the teams have gotten better every season. We've seen some very positive things from head coach Willie Green. But the question is he a good head coach, an average head coach, a great head coach? And I don't think we know the answer to that just yet. If you're an everydayer, what I always say is there's 5 guys that actively harm you. There's 5 coaches that help you win games and 20 dudes in the middle. I think Willie Green's somewhere in the middle, probably on like closer to the middle, or that like say 15 to 25 range than he would be from 15 to 10 or whatever it might be, or 15 to 5. But he's in that range somewhere in the middle. I don't think he's actively harming them at times, but isn't that one of those top 5 guys, and isn't probably a top 10 guy that could make a difference for you. And maybe that alone is a reason to make a change, but not when you're winning games. You just had a winning season. You could argue he's one of the most successful head coach in Pelicans franchise history. But here's the thing that we've seen when it comes to this team, and this is something that kind of always happens around the NBA, and you see it every single year, and I would not be shocked if we see it here. In fact, I did a show on this where I said, here's 3 shocking things that are within the realm of possibility for New Orleans, and one of those was that Willie Green is fired by January. David Griffin has done this before when he was with Cleveland. So what happens here is you have high expectations. You have good players. They're healthy, but your season isn't going the way that you want it. Look at the Milwaukee Bucks last season with their rookie head coach, Adrian Griffin, even though his record was pretty good. It just felt like it wasn't working. What's going to make more of an impact than a head coach usually is changing the players, making trades, retooling your roster. In the middle of a season, that's pretty tough to do. And if the Pelicans could do that, they would have done it already. They'd like to retool some of this roster. Look, we just talked about it in the first segment with them wanting to trade Brandon Ingram, and they have not been able to. So say you can't completely change and turn over your roster. What do you do? So there's kind of like a hierarchy of sorts when you're trying to triage an NBA season. It's not going well. What do you do? The obvious thing to me that would make the biggest difference is retool your roster. You can't do it. So you kind of go through a checklist of what can you do first before you get to like that big dramatic move of trading away a star player or something like that. It's like when if you're hurt, maybe you go through physical therapy first. You try and just rest and see if it gets better before you build up to surgery. Here, kind of the way you triage it is, number 1 is you fire your head coach. That's the first thing you do. The Bucks couldn't turn over their roster last year, so they fired Adrian Griffin and brought in Doc Rivers. You see this happen all the time. A roster is flawed, a team isn't performing well, and they just fire the head coach when truthfully it's probably not the head coach's fault that some of this is happening. But the GMs don't fire themselves for the most part. So that's what I think you could see happening here. They can't trade Brandon Ingram, otherwise they would have done it. They're not going to trade Zion in the middle of the season. That would be a dramatic shock. So what they're going to do is, if things aren't going well, is fire the head coach, probably elevate James Borrego to the interim head coach, and kind of give him a trial run with what can you do? They missed the opportunity of doing this with Chris Finch a couple of years ago in the bubble season. In Alvin Gentry's final year, David Griffin's first with the team, Zion Williamson's rookie year, it wasn't going well. And instead of firing Alvin Gentry and just elevating Chris Finch, they fired Gentry after the season and Finch left anyway. And then eventually became a head coach, and he's been very good as a head coach. If you feel James Borrego is going to be a head coach again and be a successful head coach, and look, I've liked him for a long time. I think this is a guy that can be very, very smart, and can be a good head coach. One game that he coached last year for the New Orleans Pelicans. If that's the case, you've got to at least give him that trial run to see what he can do and give you the inside track on hiring him versus letting him go elsewhere. He's the front runner for not a front runner, but he's in the running for a couple of jobs this past season. Cleveland, Los Angeles, before taking his name out of the running there and coming back to the New Orleans Pelicans. Maybe he realizes this is a job that he's going to get and he knows that it's a possibility. And I think there's probably some truth to all of that. But if you think he's going to be a good head coach and teams around the league were interested in him, well, then you've got to fire Willie Green, elevate James Borrego, if anything, just to kind of appease the fan base a little bit. But, if the Pelicans get off to a under 500 start over first 20 games, we're not going to be happy here. People are going to be frustrated, and it's going to lead to some changes. And the obvious one, if you can't trade Ingram, you're not going to trade Zion, is going to be firing the head coach, Willie Green. So I don't know if he's on the hot seat per se. That's not how I would describe it. I would describe this as something along the lines of he's kind of a scapegoat, like the sacrificial person that you just axe here to try and cause some sort of changes, even if there's bigger things that need to be addressed, maybe like the lack of a center on the roster. It's not on Willie Green, kind of is on Willie Green, I guess, with the lack of playing Jonas Valanciunas. But overall, you get what I'm trying to say when it comes to all of that. So it might end up on Willie Green as the guy that's going to kind of take the fall for things that maybe aren't his fault. That could be good or bad, depending on how you feel about Willie Green. Let me know that question in the comments down below. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. We are 2 days away now from the season starting. I can't wait. Even if I'm traveling and going to miss the home opener, be there for me, be loud. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to it. I will be watching. I will be recapping it all on here, what we learned. We're going to look at the starting lineup tomorrow. It's going to be a fun week of shows, a fun season here, I think, in New Orleans. And I hope you make Locked On Pelicans your first listen every day when it comes to that and part of your routine every day. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NolaJake on Twitter, and I'll be back with y'all tomorrow to look at the starting lineup and a big concern I have about that. I'll let you know what that is in tomorrow's show. See y'all then.